Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everybody who's able to join us. I see the attendee list is climbing rapidly, so just catch up as you join. I'm Ken Medlock, Director of the Center for Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute, and really pleased to have Nick Waith with us to run through the Energy Institute's Statistical Review of World Energy. This is one of those sort of look backs that I think everybody anticipates every summer for quite some time. And Nick, I got to say, you guys have actually done a great job of taking this on since BP sort of handed it off. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So I'm going to get out of the way and let you sort of run through this presentation. For those of you online, if you have questions, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. You're more than welcome to submit questions. I'll filter through them and we'll get this dialogue kicked off. So Nick, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Baker Institute for hosting today. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nick Waith. I'm the Chief Exec of the Energy Institute. Just very briefly, the Energy Institute is a UK professional body for energy professionals, about 20,000 members around the world. I guess the closest analogue in the States is probably the SPE. Our members span the entire breadth of energy and come from all over the world. The stats review, for those of you not familiar, as Ken said, it was run by BP for 71 years, so it goes back to 1952. And we've had the privilege of being custodian for the last 3 years of the report, and we couldn't do it by ourselves. We're very grateful for the support we get from KPMG, and it's great to have Angie on today's call, Kearney and Harriet Watt, and of course the ongoing support of BP and S&P. So I'll talk briefly about sort of three things today, sort of the global picture, talk about sort of what looks to be quite a disorderly transition, and then focus in a little bit on electricity. I'll try and bring a bit of a US slant. I'm going to move through this presentation really quickly because actually the value often comes in the conversation and your questions, which I'm sure we'll get into. So look, I don't need to give the backdrop, the big picture, other than to say that it feels like the world has been in a perma-crisis since 2020, and that clearly continues to play out across the energy system with all of the instability, but also increasingly the impacts of climate change affecting the energy system itself, and of course within that demand. So if we look at the sort of high level numbers, and one thing I should flag, and I won't get into details now, is we've slightly changed the methodology this year, and we've introduced the concept of avoided conversion losses for electrical forms of energy, notably wind and solar. So I won't get into the details, but maybe in the Q&A we can talk about that. But globally, that aside, energy demand grew by 2% in 2024. All the numbers I'll refer to are 2024 unless I explicitly say otherwise. Most of that growth coming from non-OECD. OECD growth pretty flat at 0.5%. Oil remains the dominant form of energy, accounting for about 34% of demand, and oil rose actually the slowest of all fossil fuels in 2024, but hit 101 million barrels a day in the way that we measure it last year. Coal hit a new demand record, most of that centered around Asia Pac. Natural gas, a strong rebound after a flat 2023, growing 2.5%, again, largely led by Asia Pac, but interestingly, a strong bounce back in Europe, and we'll talk more about the States. And so, the big message of this chart is that although some forms of fossil, the growth rate of demand is not accelerating, fossil still grew by about 1% in aggregate last year. And so, this, and many of you will have seen Dan Yergin's piece in Foreign Affairs, this continues to be an energy addition at a global level. But we'll talk a lot more about some of the regional nuances. I think, one sort of big message is that wind and solar grew by 16% combined last year. So continuing to see strong growth in wind and solar. So if we just look at the US very briefly, again, I'll sort of talk more about the details. I think, the really interesting point on the US, and you'll see this even more sharply defined when I talk about power later, is really the continued squeezing out of coal. So coal demand falling to a record low. Coal demand in the US hasn't been so low since 44 years ago. And just a sort of continued growth of gas in the US, including, the US gas story has been quite an incredible sort of story over the last decade. Just looking back to the global picture, the point of this chart is not to read the individual graphs, but the point is that all forms of energy reached all-time highs in 2024. Record oil, record coal, record gas, record renewables, nuclear, and hydro. You might say, well, in a growing world, this probably happens every other year. Actually, this phenomena has not happened since 2006, with the sort of ups and downs of nuclear and hydro in particular. So maybe it's sort of an artifact of all those numbers coming together in one given year, but I think it's worth highlighting. Within that, India and Indonesia continue to dominate coal growth, seeing increases of 7% and 8% respectively. I already mentioned the falls in the US, and that's continued in the developed world. Oil, including condensates and NGLs, in the US breached 20 million barrels a day. So the US now producing as much oil as the Saudi Arabia and the Russian Federation combined. And I guess, there'll be those on this call who follow the US far more closely than I do, but it'd be interesting to see whether 2024 is a high watermark for US production. And one minor point on oil is, despite China's massive import of oil, its production has increased over the last 5 years by about 10%. Gas remains dominated by the US, Russia, Iran, and China, together accounting for around half of global production, with Russia increasing exports to China, not surprisingly, but also maybe a bit more surprisingly to Europe, and Europe continuing structural decline. The US, for the second consecutive year, remains the largest exporter of LNG. Renewables, I already talked about the growth rate, but globally, solar grew 28%. So really solar just absolutely growing phenomenally. I'll talk more about the regional nuances of that in a minute, but added 455 terawatt hours of generation, which is 2.5 times the second highest contributor, which was wind. In fact, solar added 50% more than coal and gas did in power gen last year. And hydro, despite a fall in the US, saw its biggest global increase since 2010, when the Three Gorges project in China came on stream. And then nuclear, you can see on the chart here, it's been sort of, ticking along flat for really the last 2 decades, actually, beyond the scope of this chart. But nuclear saw a growth of nearly 3% last year. And so certainly this sort of, nuclear renaissance here in the UK, Sizewell C has been FID today. So it will be interesting. I would just note on nuclear, there was the COP28 aspiration to triple nuclear by 2050. And in order to do that, you'd need to be growing at 4%. So nuclear growing, but still not at the growth rate. And actually, a lot of that growth was really plants coming back online. I'm going to skip this US one. We can come back to it if we want. Let's move on from that. And then just emissions, unsurprisingly, with fossil up 1%, emissions rose globally as well, reaching an all-time high of 41 gigatons. I think what's sort of interesting on the right-hand chart, and this is sort of beginning to get into some of the sort of disorderly nature, is just some sort of, this is CO2 emissions per gigajoule. So effectively emissions intensity. And despite China continuing to add coal, actually, China has been decarbonizing the emissions intensity, not in absolute levels, but relative intensity of its energy production more than any other major bloc over the last decade. Notably, I would say that India, which had been moving in the wrong direction, also fell slightly last year. We'll come back to more on emissions. Sorry, I've just lost my slides. So I think, when you put all this together, At a global level, this continues to be an addition, as I already said. But I think, what that's sort of really missing is the regional nuances that are playing out. And in many respects, and I'll talk more about this in the power sector, those differences are diverging in large part rather than converging. And so, look, I think if there's one country that's dominating the energy picture right now, unsurprisingly, that country is China, and just the scale of what China's doing is pretty phenomenal. So China last year added more than 2.5 times the combined renewable generation of the US and Europe and India, responsible for over 60% of global solar and wind additions. And yet at the same time, China remains the world's largest emitter, responsible for nearly a third of emissions. So despite its leadership in clean energy, China's still heavily dependent on coal, which generated nearly 60% of its electricity in 2024. In the US, I already sort of talked about that squeezing of coal, and you can sort of see this. Admittedly, the numbers are a lot smaller compared to China, but you continue to see that squeezing of coal between renewables and gas. A really strong year for solar generation in the US. I'm sure and others will know more about this than I do. But as the sort of impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act flow through, 27% growth in solar in 1 year, so pretty phenomenal growth rate. And wind also pretty strong. Wind generation in the previous year actually fell slightly, and wind was back on a growth trajectory last year with 7% growth. Europe, similar picture, declining coal and increasing renewables. And then you go to India, and you can see that really all of that growth is being driven by coal, or the vast majority of the growth is being driven by coal. And quite a sobering fact is that even if India meets its really ambitious 500 gigawatt renewables target by 2030, it still needs coal to meet its energy demand. So we should expect India to continue growing for some time. I'll just talk very briefly on Africa. And for another year, growth was pretty slow. Overall energy grew by just 1%. So for the 1.5 billion people that have the least access to energy, Africa's growth is lagging the global average. Somewhat more positively, power grew by 4%. So there is increased electrification of Africa, but from a very low base. Similarly, solar grew by 10%, but from such a small base that it doesn't even register in the chart you can see on the left-hand chart. I think what you can begin to see when you look at per capita energy consumption is India now pulling away from Africa, Africa just remaining stubbornly flat in gaining access to energy. And then two other points I'll highlight on the chart on the right is number one, China for the second consecutive year consuming more energy per capita than Europe. Maybe not surprising given how much manufacturing takes place there, but still pretty significant. And then globally, you can see in the sort of lighter blue chart just below Europe and China that globally per capita consumption does continue to increase. So globally, the world is moving in the wrong direction. So and I'm conscious I'm moving through these at pace. Just turn briefly to demand for crude oil and refined products. And I think one really significant outcome of this year's data is that Chinese oil demand fell. It fell by around 1%. Now, this is a backward-looking report. And clearly there's a lot of data out there that you can look at to where 2025 is going. But I think, one thing to sort of highlight is the country that has between 50 and 60% of global growth in crude has come from China over the last decade, in fact, the last 2 decades. If China is now at peak or post-peak, I think that's pretty significant. That's been driven in part by EV penetration, about 12 million EVs sold in China last year, but also just the sort of the level of LNG going into the heavy-duty vehicle fleet in China. And then I won't dwell on this much, other than say that sort of a stagnation perhaps of global diesel and gasoline demand. I think gasoline was up slightly by about 1%, diesel fell And so I think there is a question here on when we're going to see peak demand for certainly ground transportation. Aviation fuel, kerosene continues to grow, but there is sort of a question here around the peak of refined products and crude that's beginning to emerge from the data. So let me sort of finish with the electrification story and a very strong year in 2024 for global electricity demand. Electricity demand grew by 4%, so twice the overall energy demand, and higher than the growth rate that we've seen over the last decade. And so, look, I think this isn't sort of surprising in the current context of a lot of discussion about AI and data centers, but actually the biggest driver is cooling. And I think, whilst there is clearly going to be incremental demand from data centers and all that entails, and that is affecting sort of, permitting and planning in those hotspots. Actually, I think that the far bigger structural demand is going to be cooling, and that's cooling is certainly increasingly on the agenda here in Europe, and clearly in continents like India, in Asia, and countries like India, going to be a very significant topic. I think if anything, the regional picture for power is even more disorderly. You can see here Europe, that continual sort of growth of renewables. 70% of electricity in Europe now coming from low carbon sources, including renewables, hydro, and nuclear. Those sources meeting all more than all new demand. So that displacement of fossil continues in Europe. Whilst there was growth for gas in Europe, in the power system that fell last year. And in contrast, China, kind of everything growing. And I think what's so stark on this chart is China has effectively added a whole US to its grid over the last decade. So that growth is phenomenal. I think the really interesting thing on China is just the rate of change, though. So in 2023, coal contributed over half the year-on-year change, whereas in 2024, coal just contributed 10% of the year-on-year change. So although coal still grew, it only added a fraction of the year-on-year growth. And so if that trajectory continues, we end up in a world where low carbon sources of energy begin to displace fossil in China. I'll come on to the US in a minute. But India, again, unsurprisingly, although renewables are growing at a pretty fast rate, it's from such a small base that you really can't see the incremental growth, and most of that demand continuing to be met by coal. And then just very briefly, this chart's slightly misleading because everything's green. I'm not sure why this was pulled up for today's presentation. But I think it's sort of pretty remarkable actually over the last 20 years, just the change in the US grid. This is covering Canada as well. But a really stark change. But notably, I think the role of gas actually playing as much of that growth story as renewables over that period. So I think just sort of wrapping up the presentation, and I do apologize for the rate I've gone through, but I think it's important we open up for a conversation. The Stats Review continues to be the fullest and most reliable account of how the world produced, consumed, traded all forms of energy. And yeah, as always, it probably raises more questions than it does answers, but I think it's important that it continues to provide the data as it does. And from our perspective, the world is using more energy than ever before, record everything in 2024. But I think there are some important things going on in that. I talked about the rate of electrification really picking up, particularly in the US, but frankly, everywhere, underpinned by that phenomenal growth in renewables. I think we are beginning to, we've reached inflection points on the grid in developed economies. We're approaching an inflection point, I would assert, on China. Similarly, on oil growth, notable that although oil did grow in 2024, it grew less fast than pretty much every other form of energy, and a notable decline in China. And really this sort of, not only the regional differences, but this sort of increasingly divergent view of what's happening in the world. And I think it just sort of reinforces that everybody's at different starting points, everybody's moving at different paces, and then the displacement of one form of energy, is really varying as you go around the world. So look, with that, I'll stop talking. All the data can be downloaded for free from the website. And Ken, back to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. So I've got a few questions that have come through, and I promise I will get to them, but I have a couple I'm going to sort of take as moderator's prerogative to ask first. But before I do that, Angie, I don't know if you wanna chime in and say anything. If you do, please take this opportunity.
Yeah, no, I just want to say from a KPMG perspective, I lead our energy practice for the US, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with the Energy Institute. There's so much data here. I would like to remind people that you can download it. It's all free. You can download it for free. You can manipulate the data into charts that you would like. And so it tells such a rich story over the last 74 years, really, of how our energy system has changed. And particularly right now, as we're in the midst of a disruption, it's even more important to see really some of how the trends are emerging.
Excellent, thank you. I can tell you I use the data quite often, so it's a great resource. I agree. So Nick, I'm going to ask right out of the gate, because you said you'd come back to this, the avoided conversion losses that you mentioned, and sort of that is a shift in methodology, and I understand it, but I think for everybody's edification, it'd be good if you could sort of dive into that a little bit.
I will do my best, Ken. On the website, there are more details on it. I think the way that BP, the reason we've changed the methodology is to fall in line with others. And the difference, it's quite a simple difference that effectively before we used to gross up the kind of input from wind and solar, and we effectively adjusted them as if they were gas going into a CCGT. So, and it was the amount of energy equivalent you would need to generate that much electricity. And I think on the one hand, that meant that you reflected the greater efficiency in the system by direct electrification. But what it's done is it's as renewables have become, a much more significant share of the mix, it's distorting the whole, because you're scaling up part of it, and therefore you're creating an impression of total energy demand that's actually higher than the world is using. So we've stripped that out. I insisted with the team we showed those avoided losses, and if you go back to where those avoided losses are, the total is what the number would have been in the old methodology. So basically, add those avoided losses back in gets you to the primary energy equivalent we would have provided in last year's. And the data, you can look at it with and without. We've got that all on the website historically as well. But I think there's an important point within that of course, we're still looking at this through the lens of energy input. So, sort of energy supplied rather than energy demanded. And I think there's a question I've seen in the Q&A that we'll probably get to in a minute that sort of, I think one of the misnomers in all of this is that the world needs more energy. And actually, the point I would make is the world needs more useful energy. And so I think it's increasingly important we think about the efficiency of the whole system.
Yeah, so I mean, sorry, Angie, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it's probably important too, Nick, to say this is something that we've been grappling with for the last couple of years. And as the divergence between the different methodologies continued to have a wider gap, we knew we were going to have to bite the bullet at some point and make the switch. So, this is something we've been thinking about for a few years now.
I know we've had a few posts on sort of the conspiracy angles behind this, but there really isn't any other driver for it.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly with the idea of energy services. I mean, because efficiency is a virtual source of supply. So if you get into a discussion about the efficiency of the energy system, then that's certainly sort of a beneficial place to sort of launch into. Um, I I wanted to ask you a question that is kind of linked to some of the stuff that's been sort of posted in the Q&A, but a little different maybe. It gets into sort of regional differences, and one of the things that you highlighted is that, oil demand grew at a slower rate than it had in previous years, and that's honestly, if it keeps growing at 1 million barrels a day a year, the rate's going to slow just because the base is getting bigger. But
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
but the point that I'd like you to dive into a little bit is not so much the driver of, which you pointed out as sort of China being the driver of a slowing growth rate because of what's happened with oil demand there. And arguably, you can make you can steer that discussion into one about energy security, which is why they're leaning into coal still. They're really leaning into renewables. It's really about control of supply chains. But you referenced peak in demand, and of course, this has been a very controversial topic, right?
Yeah.
With some agencies projecting, and this is not what this is, but projecting, a peak that's sort of imminent, and then others, as recently as 2 weeks ago. So OPEC released their outlook, and they've got growth in their base case through 2050, but what I want to ask about is what you see in the historical data with regard to demand growth in less developed countries. So here we can get into what's happening in the entire suite of African countries, what's happening in India, because you pointed to India and you see tremendous growth in coal. That's largely due to efforts to electrify, but there's also significant efforts ongoing in that country to expand its transportation networks, which is going to connect to oil. So I wonder what you're seeing in the historical data and whether or not that may actually tell a different story going forward.
Yeah, and I think, clearly India, and I talked about India, is growing all forms of fossil, and it's not alone. I was in Malaysia a few weeks ago, and the same is true there. In other parts of ASEAN, we're seeing those similar trends. I think, and you're right to highlight, Ken, that China, this agenda has been driven, I think, for two reasons. Number one, energy security, and by the way, China has, if you sort of took out the interventions China's made, it's reduced its energy independence over the last 5 years by the equivalent of a Europe, 1 year of Europe, in terms of energy imports. So there's a clear strategic energy independence point you're right to make. I think the other point, China is clearly, it can't win on the ICE age of vehicles. It can absolutely dominate, and it is absolutely going to dominate the world of EVs. And we're seeing that all over Europe right now, and many other parts of the world. I think it's really interesting where countries like India, in particular, but also Africa, are going to go. I mean, Africa really isn't growing at scale. Of course, if you strip it down country by country, you do see some pockets of growth, but it's stagnant. And I think the question is, do those countries are they motivated to, not for climate reasons, but for energy security reasons, go down a similar path to China, or is it one of sort of fossil fuels first? And I don't know which way they're going to take, but I think that there's probably going to be a sort of a race playing out over the next decade or so as to the rate China continues on this path versus the rate of fossil growth in India and Africa. And the balance of that will indicate which forecast is right on crude demand. I don't know if Angie or you, Ken, have got other insights you want to share on that.
It's an important trend to watch because the United Nations estimates by 2050, 1 in 4 of the people in the global population will live in Africa. So as Africa continues to grow, and they continue to need energy, it's going to be an incredible challenge. I think affordability is probably one of the key drivers. We see this. It's affordability, it's reliability, it's energy security, and then it's sustainability, obviously. But I think for Africa, affordability is going to be a key aspect. So can we get to a point down the road where renewables, gas, oil, what's the affordability mix of those sources.
Certainly, and that sort of gets into an entirely very important but tangential discussion about overall system cost, because affordability is not just about the cost of a project. It's the cost of integrating that project into a broader supply chain. But, and Nick, there's a request for you to show the QR code again. Can I get you to sort of bring that up on your screen, and we'll kind of just continue the discussion.
Yeah, sure.
So you also mentioned, which I thought was very appropriate, cooling demand for energy is a huge driver of what we're seeing, and I'm not sure that the QR code is visible yet. There we go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
there you go.
So I wonder if, and I'm going to bring us back to what is often referred to collectively as the global South, but and you leaned into Europe and how cooling demand is certainly becoming an issue there. But given the fact that a vast majority of underserved communities in the energy landscape are in that sort of between the tropics, if you will, that window that gets quite warm. As you see development occurring in some of those countries that we have historical data on, what are you seeing in the electric power sector there? Where are some of the sort of surprises, if you will, over the last couple of years that you've seen?
Well, I think I mean, it's sort of happening globally, Ken. So I think that, so it's not our numbers. That the IEA estimate that about 60% of growth is being driven by cooling. And clearly that's sort of happening everywhere. But I think this has yet to really happen at scale. So, I think as Africa, we saw the numbers on per capita energy use in Africa. Africa doesn't have cooling at scale in the way that the US does. Likewise, India ahead, but not really having a scale of cooling that it's going to need. And then, there are live conversations happening in Europe and France and the UK, which have very low penetration rates of cooling, where people are now thinking about cooling for home. So I think much of this is really yet to happen, Ken. I think everybody focuses on data centers and AI, and clearly, that's not immaterial. But if you want to kind of, get excited about, where growth of electricity is going to come from, I think cooling is going to dominate. I mean, the other point in all of this is, that the big hyperscalers, they don't want to spend huge amounts of money investing in PPAs, in nuclear, in gas, in any form. They're not motivated to spend money on energy. And so I do think we can expect advances in how the efficiency of data centers, the temperatures that they can operate at, and of course the heat recovery from those systems that will ensure that energy is more efficiently used. So I think the big macro trend here is going to be cooling over data centers. That's my view, at least.
Okay. No, that's interesting. And we can certainly go down a rabbit hole on data centers. That is the sort of topic du jour, if you will, lately.
Yeah.
There's a question online that I think would be useful for you to address. It has to do with how you guys are actually counting biofuels. In particular, it's read, could you please discuss the pros and cons of not counting liquid biofuels? Maybe if you could dive in a little bit what you're doing on that front.
Yeah, so we pull out biofuels as a separate line item. So in contrast to the IEA, we don't lump them in with oil production. So there is, if you look in the data tables, there are separate line items on biofuels, biodiesel, biogasoline as well.
Okay, very good.
By country.
Yeah. So
I believe the IEA include it within their oil, which is why the IEA always have a slightly higher oil demand number than us.
Yeah, that I was about to dig into that a little bit, because that was another question asking about the differences between different agencies and the oil demand or oil production levels that are reported. But I think you just handled it right there. So thank you for.
And one thing I'll
one.
flag is we don't even attempt to measure biomass that's used for cooking. And I know that others do, but I think it's very much a top down. So we don't have numbers for that. So that is a gap in our data set. Just because I think it's very difficult to measure that with any degree of fidelity.
Yes, and I'll add something to that on the biomass for cooking and heating stuff like that. A lot of that is actually estimated. It's not
Yeah.
actually reported because it's traditionally a non-commercial fuel.
You,
So
you can't
yeah,
you can't measure it. So we
I
try to.
100% agree. Yeah. Angie, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that's, I don't have anything specifically on the biofuels.
Okay. Um, kind of scrolling through the question. Here's a good one. It goes back to the concept of efficiency, which you kind of leaned into in the answer to avoided conversion loss. Uh, what do you see on two fronts? First, on a regional basis, is there a significant difference across regions in terms of what the data is revealing on the efficiency of delivered energy services? And then, what do you see if the data even reveals this in terms of what you're doing? There's a question about biggest bang for the buck, right, in terms of driving efficiency improvements. So, I wonder if you could lean into both of those a little bit.
Yeah, and look, one thing I should say is we don't currently measure end use. So I would love to take this product to the next level where you measure, where does every molecule, every electron end up, and then you could begin to kind of really understand the consumer efficiency point. I think so. Look, we look at Europe, and Europe structurally has been declining in energy for a long time. It's been declining in fossil for an even longer time. But it's quite, so for example, when the Russia-Ukraine war started in 2022, it was quite difficult to say, well, how much of that is because people are just having cooler homes versus the sort of efficiency. So I think there's a huge opportunity to better understand the data of that, and that's something we'd like to do through time. But that clearly is a massive undertaking to understand that. I think one of the real challenges Europe has got is deindustrialization because of high energy prices, and that's a big issue here in the UK. It's a big issue in countries like Germany. So I'd love to unpick more around this energy efficiency. What I would say at a global level is that with per capita energy demand increasing, and in part not increasing where it needs to, like Africa, we are still moving in the wrong direction. I know somebody in the Q&A has picked up my sort of use of the wrong direction, but if we believe that energy efficiency is an important part of meeting Paris targets and COP targets, and there's a sort of effectively a 4% efficiency pledge that was set at COP 28, then we're not moving in the right direction to deliver that yet.
Yeah, so that gets in. Go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
I think, Ken, so where's the proof point that you can see it? Well, 12 million EVs in China is beginning to dent into, crude demand in China. So, if an EV is on average sort of 3 times more efficient than an ICE, that's where you're going to begin to see it. And the numbers up until now have been too small to sort of really pick it out. But that is part of the decline in Chinese oil demand.
Yeah, I think another way to sort of lean into the per capita discussion is you have to be able to distinguish between energy services and the quantity of a particular energy carrier, and the two aren't necessarily the same. So that gets into the efficiency comment, right? So you also just mentioned deindustrialization in Europe, and there's another question that is linked to this, and it's actually one that I fundamentally have just about the future of energy. When you look at industrial activity, it tends to, particularly energy intensive industrial activity, it tends to favor lower cost energy. So if you start to see this trend in Europe either accelerate or extend itself into other places, even China, where does it go? because the demand for those goods is not disappearing. And it ultimately leads us down a path of trying to understand, how energy use, we talked about Africa a little bit. You can talk about India. They, of course, have a manufacturing base that they're, looking to expand. And Latin America hasn't even come up yet, right? But that certainly will play a role. I wonder if you could lean into a little bit of that just in terms of what you see on how the data are revealing some broader macro trends and what that might mean.
Yeah, I don't know, Angie, if you want to sort of lead on that and I can chip in.
One of the interesting things that I think we're seeing in the data is the role that natural gas is playing in terms of providing for that mix and in terms of a lower cost basis. And historically, maybe some folks have talked about natural gas as being a bridge fuel until you can get to more renewables. But I don't think that's the case that we're seeing at all. And particularly when you layer on top the role that the U.S. will play in LNG exports, I think natural gas really has a role to play in providing dense energy intensity and also an affordability aspect.
And look, I think, to build on that's given the US huge competitive advantage compared, versus Europe in manufacturing. I think there needs to be a concerted effort in Europe, and this is a live conversation. I was at an event yesterday here in London with our Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, and other government ministers, that there is a real drive to bring down that industrial cost of electricity and energy more broadly. There within that are difficult choices to be made on the structure of pricing, and in particular in the UK, it's sort of the cost of gas for natural gas versus the cost of electricity. But both are harming UK competitiveness. I think there's also a reality that there's a narrative of European countries seeking to get large quantities of low carbon energy from other parts of the world. And actually, I think what I see increasingly in Africa is rightly the question being saying, well, why would we export our energy when we can export products? So rather than export, gas or green hydrogen or green ammonia from Africa to Europe, why wouldn't we just produce fertilizer and export fertilizer to Europe? And I'm actually quite pleased to see that is happening in Africa, because I think that whole value chain needs to be thought of. And I think there is a reality that heavily industrialized developed economies like Germany and Japan structurally are going to be disadvantaged, and you can deny that and try and subsidize your way through that, or there's a rebasing potentially of which industries you choose to try and compete in. And I think the UK perhaps is somewhat more advantaged in that because we've got such a service-oriented economy. But that's not belittling the challenges that many of the remaining industrial businesses do face here.
That's interesting. So a couple of questions sort of leaning into other regions, and I was going to ask a variant of this anyway. You commented on the global growth that we've seen in the solar and wind landscape in particular. The thing that's kind of, I don't know, it could be potentially really interesting is understand how those resources are growing in some of the smaller, less developed sort of countries across regions around the world, some of which are more developed, obviously. So if we go to the Middle East, for example, what are we seeing in the historical data with regard to energy on those fronts? Across North Africa, so more broadly, we could talk about the MENA region, but then into Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. I wonder if you could maybe comment a little bit on what the data are revealing with regard to those energy sources in particular in those regions.
Yeah, on wind and solar, Ken.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really quite interesting how much it varies. I mean, there are some incredibly high growth rates in part of the MENA region, so I think Oman and Saudi Arabia, but that's just the maths of starting with a very low base. Right. I think to me, the US was a real standout. By the way, I mean, for the US to grow 27% solar in 1 year based on a pretty large installed capacity in the first instance is pretty remarkable. But actually, Pakistan was a real standout. That had a very strong year. I forget the specific percentage growth, but very significant growth of solar in Pakistan. I think it is happening where governments make specific choices. The Inflation Reduction Act, clearly, a real policy choice in the US that has made a difference. And then, the flip side of that is, Europe, growth rates pretty slow for renewables right now. Wind grew just by 2%, I think, in Europe last year versus sort of 8%. And a lot of that is the constraints of planning, of permitting, of grid constraints. So I think it's a function of the maths and where you are on that journey. So it's clearly easier to grow from a small base, but also where governments are making concerted efforts to grow in a particular technology.
I think that regulatory government framework is so critical in terms of where you're seeing the growth. Without that, you tend to not see growth in the renewables, but you've got to have the regulatory, favorable incentives from a tax perspective to really stimulate that growth. Because you're also changing the system, the energy system, a bit as well when you're putting in renewables.
So one thing that always strikes me is the conversation about the energy mix is historically kind of been an either or type discussion. And Nick, you mentioned it's everything that's been growing, and that's evident from the data. I guess the question I have is, and Angie, you just leaned into government policy as being a driver of what, different adoption rates. But as you start to see more of everything deployed, you're effectively increasing the number of competitive margins across the energy landscape. And, for the consumer, that shouldn't be a bad thing, right? But in general, I don't know that it's revealed itself in the data yet, but maybe this is kind of a forward-looking question I'm about to ask you. If you see those competitive margins really starting to flex, when does the government support no longer actually matter? So in other words, when can public policy kind of take a step back and just let competition drive the outcome?
So I think in parts of the world that may already be happening. I always find it. I know you're in Texas. I spent time living in Texas, and there's everything everything is happening in Texas when it comes to energy because it's it is commercial. I know that the Inflation Reduction Act clearly gives a bit of a leg up to some of those technologies, but actually I think solar would be flying without those. It was before the Inflation Reduction Act and will continue regardless of what happens to the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's a really complex question in some levels it's a really basic question in some markets. I mean, here in the UK, it's an example where there are big government choices that have been made and continue to be made. For example, there's been a huge debate on zonal pricing, which effectively, in simple terms, is whether the whole UK should have a single price or whether you price according to supply and demand. And the government has now decided on that, a highly polarized debate. And so that wasn't so much about subsidy, but about creating a clear framework that then the industry knows how to invest on. The UK government's just made a huge decision around nuclear, investing in a £38 billion nuclear project. That therefore has pretty significant impact on what the UK energy shape is going to look like. So I think it's a really big question, Ken, and I'm probably not giving sort of a very clear answer, but I do think in some markets the fundamentals begin to drive. In other markets, I think governments will continue to need to sort of set the conditions for some time to come.
And I think from a consumer standpoint, it's really about affordability and it's about reliability. So you want to have affordable access to energy, whether that's renewables or fossil fuels. But if you look at the amount that solar for instance, adds to the Texas grid from a mix. That's pretty substantial. But if you look at EVs and some of what you're seeing around consumer sentiment around EVs, really the key barriers are affordability. Consumers see those as too expensive, and reliability. When you flip your light switch on, you want your power to come on, or when you get in your car, you want to have security and peace of mind that you're going to be able to get to your destination and back without having any challenges from a charging infrastructure perspective or anything like that. So I think that affordability and reliability from a consumer sentiment is really key to this.
Yeah, one thing, and by the way, Nick, I'm glad you leaned into how different everywhere is, because that's something that I've been talking about for well over a decade. And a lot of times the discussion about transitions is sort of, it's a single vector, right? We're going to go all renewables everywhere, but in reality, the resource endowments don't support that everywhere. So you've got to think a little bit more broadly. So it gets into the principle of comparative advantage, really, in terms of what.
Absolutely. Look, I mentioned Malaysia. That's a system that's still 95% dependent on fossil, coal, oil, gas, investing heavily in CCUS. Wind is challenging in Malaysia. Solar is, despite being very close to the equator, solar is not as good as it is in other parts of the world. Really difficult choices to make. So I think it's really important. And I saw in the Q&A there was a bit of a prompt of a question around sort of a European perspective. I'm very mindful. I travel around the world. Every system is different. The natural merit order is different. And I think, to me, it's really understanding the merit order and the system sort of integration value as well. I think nuclear tends to be very polarized, particularly here in Europe, but in most parts of the world. And my view on nuclear is, it's far easier to decarbonize with nuclear on the system than it is if it's not on the system. So, whether it makes sense for the UK to invest 38 billion pounds, $50 million pretty much in a single nuclear plant, time will tell. But it's not going to be a single solution in any location.
Yeah, to that point, and the role of policy, because the nuclear decision has been heavily impacted by direct policy decisions, right? But the economics are challenging in certain places as well. That's undoubtedly true. But the one thing that is striking in a world where you mentioned the Paris Agreement and trying to hit certain sort of emissions reduction targets, when you look back at the data you showed, I think since 2020, every single form of energy has grown except nuclear, and that's actually fallen. So that is a little eye-opening when you think about the broader aspiration to, cut carbon emissions. But at the same time, you have to understand there are other priorities at play everywhere when we think about how the future of energy is going to unfold. There is a really interesting question I want to ask you before we wrap up. That came through on the chat. It's, if there was one data series you could add to the review, which would it be? And this individual says they would pick capital investment because there's been a lot of discussion about improving energy efficiency, but that needs to be in the context of the capital efficiency of incremental energy-related investment. So, that's maybe seeding the answer a little bit, but I'd love to hear your answer to that one, because I think that's a good question.
Look, I think capital investment is important. We don't track that, but I think there are many others who do. So that if you want to go and look at capital investment, you can go and look at other people's numbers on that. I mean, the thing I would love to do is to have the full energy picture. So one of the big criticisms we get, and I've had it again this time, is the primary energy fallacy. So you're only looking at the supply, you're measuring the world through this primary energy route, and actually, in an increasingly electrified world, that theoretically would be far more efficient. And we talked a bit about that in the context of EVs. I would love to be able to kind of take this product through the whole value chain and take it down to the the number of EVs, the heat pumps, the entire system of energy to really give those insights as to where there are system inefficiencies and how those evolve through time, which we have started to do a little bit with the product, but there's a huge opportunity. For those of you who haven't seen them, I'd really recommend looking at the Lawrence Livermore Labs Sankey diagrams that show that. You can look at the sort of US. I'd love to be able to kind of get that level of granularity across all of our data. But that's a big project, so it will take us some time to get there.
That's Herculean to say the least. Angie, do you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I think we'll move to a system in the future where it's much more behind the meter type of energy production. So individuals will have, their various forms of or businesses of energy, whether that's SMRs or it's around solar panels or it's around wind, and being able to capture all of those disparate aspects of production behind the meter. I think that's something that's going to be an important thing in the future, because I certainly think that's going to increase.
That's a great point, because you're seeing a lot of that with data center development in the United States, a lot of interest, and that's industrial scale behind the meter. So it's, certainly a lot of individual commercial and residential users of sort of own energy, if you will, behind the meter energy. That's something that's not really captured very well in any data set. So,
and I'll tell you, again, it's not a UK point, but it will apply in many parts of the world, is the grid didn't really have any idea how much consumption solar production was sitting on people's domestic rooftops. It was nobody had actually thought to measure the data on how much energy is being produced by solar panels on people's homes. And as more and more homes have that, it's still a gap. And the way it shows up is a reduction in electricity demand rather than generation of solar here in the UK. So I agree with all of that.
Excellent. Well, we're only about 4 minutes away from sort of our scheduled time. So what I'd like to do, Nick, Angie, give you both a couple of minutes to make some sort of closing remarks. And Nick, I'll start with you.
Well, look, thank you so much for hosting us again. I'm always conscious this is a vast undertaking in terms of how much data there is to get through, and we've really skimmed the surface. I just encourage everybody to kind of download it. We always find people get more insights. I think we're at a really interesting point in this energy transition. I know that we've deliberately sort of labeled it a disorderly transition. I think people sometimes imagine there's going to be a really orderly, linear transition, and I really think that the data is indicating that this isn't going to work in that way. I think I recognise the challenge that was made by some of the Q&A in the chat that bringing a European perspective is I accept that, but I also think look at the progress that is being made in the US as much as anywhere. And if you can look at one country in respect of sort of peak demand, I think China is the one to watch out for. So watch this space on China, because that's going to drive a lot of what happens in the coming decade.
Angie?
Yeah, a disorderly transition is not necessarily a bad thing. And we're at a really interesting, I think, point in our energy history. So I would encourage people to pay attention to the signposts and what they're telling you. Things like China, what we're going to see around oil demand, certain aspects that to come around natural gas, around how the nuclear evolves. Those are really important signposts that can help particularly energy companies make strategic bets and stay competitive in the years to come.
Excellent. So the one thing I'll take away from this, Nick, is I was really glad to see in the country-specific diagrams that you listed, and you highlighted India. I think for several years now, people have underestimated what's happening in that country and what will happen in that country. But I tend to believe if you want to understand the future of energy going out to 2050, and there's nothing magical about 2050, it's just one we tend to focus on. I think that's the country to watch, because that's an area that's growing rapidly, and in terms of per capita income and energy use per capita, all that kind of stuff, those metrics that we typically refer to, India is very much in the place China was in the early 2000s. So given the scale of that economy, it could be game changing in terms of what happens there over the next 25 years. So I'm really glad to see you highlight that. And great to have you with us again. Look forward to doing this again next year, and seeing what new modifications you bring on, because it's a great service that you offer.
Thank you for hosting us. Really appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and close. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, and until next time.